The year was 1916. In a Chicago hotel room perfumed with incense and adorned with red roses, reporters gathered to meet Fox Studios' mysterious new starlet, Theda Bara, and to hear the tale of her exotic, quote-unquote, foreign origins. They heard that Theda had been born beneath the Egyptian pyramids, the result of a passionate romance between a French actress and an Italian sculptor, and that she had achieved great fame in France as an actress before fleeing to America during the World War. Eventually, the curtains parted to reveal a veiled woman lying on a sofa draped with tiger skins. She spoke about the vampire character she would be playing in Fox's upcoming film, A Fool There Was. This vampire, Theda purred, possessed a heart that was a charnel house of men's dead hopes and withered ambitions. Some night, when she faces old age and her mirror shows her wrinkles, she will kill herself. Gas or poison, but nothing that would disfigure her. But as the slightly stunned reporters filed away, this quote-unquote Arabian actress ripped off her heavy veils and started speaking in a perfect American accent. Theda Bara, the Serpent of the Nile, was a persona, an elaborate invention that would soon capture the imagination of the American public, making Theda one of the silent screen's most famous actresses and its first real sex symbol. But who was the real Theda Bara, the woman behind the facade? Well, for one, she wasn't born in Egypt. She wasn't even called Theda. Her birth name was Theodosia Goodman, and if you've watched Hamilton, you already know which Theodosia she was named after.
Dear Theodosia, what to say to you?
The eldest daughter of an affluent tailor and a wig maker, Theda spent an idyllic childhood in Cincinnati, far away from the pyramids of Gaza. She was, by all accounts, a lively child, a voracious reader and a born troublemaker who often ran away from harm, once escaping through a hole she had made in the screen door while wearing her mother's best gown and hat. By the time she reached high school, Theda was kind of a goth and a theater kid. She wore black capes, liked mysticism, and above all was obsessed with becoming a stage actress. She enrolled in the University of Cincinnati, which, by the way, was quite rare for a woman of her time, but dropped out in 1905, instead moving to New York to follow her dreams. What she did for the next 3 years remains a mystery. Theda later said that she spent these years traveling Europe with an acting troupe and performing in amateur productions of Shakespeare, but there's no real evidence to back this up. Eventually, though, she managed to get bit parts in small, not particularly successful plays like The Devil and the Quaker Girl, but never really got her big break. By 1914, Theda was almost 30 and still a relative nobody. Money was running out and her career seemed to have fizzled out before it even started. It was also around this time that the film industry began to really explode in popularity. Silent films were becoming increasingly longer, more complicated, and more profitable. The age of the film star had dawned. Gossip magazines became filled with fascinating, mostly fabricated stories about the lives of performers like Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and Lillian Gish, who achieved heights of fame undreamed of by stage actors. Out of work and a little desperate, Theda also turned to the movies. She applied for a bit part in a courtroom drama/thriller called The Stain. The film wasn't very good. The only reason it's remembered today is because it was Theda Bara's screen debut. Theda was only an extra, but her enormous striking eyes, long dark hair, and magnetic screen presence attracted the attention of director Frank Powell, who recommended her to William Fox as a possible leading lady for his upcoming film. William Fox was a businessman and entrepreneur who owned the newly established Fox Studios. Born in Hungary, he was an immigrant who grew up in abject poverty in New York, working odd jobs to make ends meet. He first entered show business by purchasing and then later building a series of film theaters around New York. Eventually, after years of distributing movies by other studios and flush with cash, Fox turned to producing his own titles. In 1914, he bought the rights to a scandalous stage play named A Fool There Was, hoping for a big blockbuster hit to finally put his studio on the map. The play was inspired by an 1897 painting called The Vampire, which shows a seductive young woman leaning over a man. He lies beneath her, either unconscious or asleep, while she regards him with a dominant, triumphant, and rather predatory expression. The painting, with its naked display of female power and sexuality, caused great scandal and inspired the author Rudyard Kipling to write the poem The Vampire, in which a foolish youth is seduced, destroyed, and discarded by a ruthless vampire woman. The term vampire doesn't exactly mean bloodsucker or Dracula in this context, more like femme fatale or villainous. After rejecting multiple actresses for the role, Fox interviewed Theda Bara and hired her on a $150 a week contract. She was given a snappier, more glamorous stage name and asked to lie about her age, because no leading lady could be 30 years old. Shooting began in late 1914, and Theda initially found the transition from stage to screen difficult. "I shall never forget the terrible experience of my first scene," she told a reporter. "I had to wear makeup in the public street and felt like a lost soul." This is hardly surprising. Screen makeup in the 1910s was ugly. Theda would have been wearing yellow grease paint on her face, black kohl around the eyes, and dark red, almost brown lipstick that made her look clownish. Also, because Fox wanted the film done as quickly as possible, Theda was not allowed many retakes. In this scene, for example, you can clearly see her trying to keep her dress strap from falling over, and though she later begged for a reshoot, she didn't get one. After the film was finished, Fox launched a lavish PR campaign to promote it. Stories about Theda's exotic French-Arabian background and vampire nature were plastered all over the press. They nicknamed Theda the wickedest woman in the world and released lurid quotes about her interest in the occult and her connection to the quote-unquote exotic, savage Orient. Of course, most reporters and readers thought that this was all nonsense, but it created enough public interest to make A Fool There Was the most successful movie of 1915. The New York Morning Telegraph called the vampire the most revolting but fascinating character that has appeared upon the screen for some time. Theda Bara became an overnight sensation, almost literally. Of course, not all the attention was positive. Some women's organizations and Catholic groups staged protests against her. Take, for example, the Women's Civic Club of Elmhurst, who proposed to ban Theda's films for, quote, compromising the morals of young women and children, in particular. Eager to capitalize upon Theda's success, Fox set to work on a flurry of new projects for their new star. By the end of 1915, Theda had appeared in 9 new movies for Fox, playing some version of the vamp character in most of them. In The Kreutzer Sonata, she is the wicked sister who steals the main character's husband. In The Clemenceau Case, she plays a wife who is murdered by her husband after she threatens to seduce and ruin his best friend. In The Devil's Daughter, she plays a young woman who, after being abandoned by her lover, vows revenge on all men and ruins the marriage of a young couple. This first flood of vamp movies was a huge financial success for Fox. The vamp became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of dangerous femininity that reflected fears about the role of women in early 20th century society. You see, the 1910s were a time of social change for women. Women were entering higher educational institutions and the workforce in increasing numbers. Suffragettes were loudly demanding votes for women. And of course, these changes were being accompanied by conservative backlash about the destructive consequences of women breaking out of their traditional roles. And on one hand, Theda's vampire can be seen as a kind of sort of feministy figure. Take this quote she gave in 1915. "Believe me, for every woman vampire there are 10 men of the same type. Men who take everything from women, love, devotion, beauty, youth, and give nothing in return. V stands for vampire, and it stands for vengeance too. The vampire that I play is the vengeance of my sex upon its exploiters. You see, I have the face of a vampire perhaps, but the heart of a feminist." And there is something liberating, almost cathartic, about a woman who strikes back against patriarchal oppression and unleashes her rage against the men who wronged her. This, after all, is the appeal of the modern femme fatale. But to consider Theda's vampire as a progressive feminist character is overly simplistic. Theda's vampire does not have any real depth or humanity to her. She's a caricature, a remorseless villain with no complex backstory or motivations to properly contextualize her actions. In most of her movies, the vamp preys on men for petty personal reasons like being unable to get over a breakup or simply for fun. And in most of her movies, the vamp dies at the end, telling audiences exactly what will happen if they step out of line and start behaving like her. Ultimately, the vampire is a conservative caricature of what might happen if a woman is not properly restrained and instead allowed unchecked power. If the vampire is a feminist, well then the feminist is a villain. She's an amoral, vengeful creature who uses her sexuality to destroy men. Theda herself soon began resenting the studio for typecasting her as a villainess. The films that Fox was putting her in were getting increasingly formulaic and sensational. Theda wanted meatier, more nuanced roles where she could flex her acting muscles. She said, "I wish to the uttermost depths of my soul for a part in which I'd neither be an incarnation of evil, as I am now, nor an incarnation of holiness. I want to play a kind-hearted, lovable human woman. Won't someone write me such a part?" There was also a dissonance between Theda's public image and her quiet personal life. Theda was not a young, wild starlet. She had achieved fame as a level-headed, mature, almost middle-aged woman. There was never anything in the press about her love life. She didn't have any public issues with drugs or partying. Instead, she was remembered as a calm professional with a good sense of humor about her absurd public image. She just lived with her mother, worked long hours on the half a dozen films Fox set up for her, and spent her free time reading, just as she had as a child. Now, don't get me wrong, Fox did give Theda some chances to play a non-vamp heroine role. One of these rare opportunities came in 1916 with the movie East Lynne. Based on a Victorian melodrama, the movie tells the completely unrealistic story of a wife and a mother who, after being disfigured in a train accident, returns to her family, who no longer recognize her as a governess. The movie isn't very good. The plot is contrived and the acting is exaggerated, but it's worth mentioning because it's one of 3 complete surviving Theda Bara films. And this is the great tragedy, really, of Theda Bara. Theda appeared in over 40 movies for Fox, out of which only 3 exist. Her most iconic films, Cleopatra, Salome, the films that critics agreed best showcased her considerable talents, are all lost. Most were destroyed in 1937 when a devastating fire broke out at a Fox film storage facility. This fire was basically the film equivalent of the burning of the Library of Alexandria. 75% of Fox's feature films from before 1930 were lost in it. And because of this, we will never be able to form an accurate and complete assessment of Theda's abilities as an actress. We will never see her in her greatest roles, and must instead puzzle together an incomplete picture of her from the handful of mediocre films that remain. In 1917, at the very height of her fame, Theda began work on the epic historical film Cleopatra. It was the ultimate vamp role. Theda's Cleopatra would be a seductress who drove her lovers Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to ruin before killing herself with a venomous snakebite. It was to be Fox's most expensive project yet, an unprecedented feat of filmmaking as described in this article. 1,000 marvelous scenes. Power, beauty, costly extravagance unequaled. William Fox initiates a series of historical pictures to last for all time, and Cleopatra proves his success. 30,000 people in one picture. One woman to present Cleopatra's story with full power impersonates the Nile Siren as history shows her. In 50 different costumes, each matched with a complete set of jewels, Miss Bara represents a day when the toll of 100,000 was spent on clothing one. 80 vessels of ancient days were specially constructed for the battle scenes and burned to the water's edge. 3,000 horses were employed in the battle and desert scenes. In this William Fox film, the great producer has completely outdone himself and all others. Theda and her mother moved to California for filming, where she was provided with a special residence, furnished in the Oriental vampire style, and complete with a pet snake for Theda to stroke during press conferences. She appeared on set wearing a wild array of scandalous costumes, and it was said that she was followed by 3 dressmakers carrying needles and thread who would repair her costumes the minute they got damaged. And since the film is lost except for 9 seconds of footage, all we have to remember Cleopatra by are these costumes. And they are quite magnificent, bizarre and experimental, scandalously revealing even by modern standards sometimes, and beautiful in an eerie, avant-garde kind of way. After shooting finished, Fox's publicity department once again set to work. They spread the wild rumor that an ancient prophecy had been discovered in a tomb near the Egyptian city of Thebes, which read, "I, Rames, priest of Set, tell you this. She shall seem a snake to most men. She shall lead them to sin and to their destruction. Yet she shall not be so. She shall be good and virtuous and kind of heart, but she shall not seem so to most men." This alleged prophecy ended with the Greek letter theta, or Theda, so according to Fox, Theda had basically been fated to play this role. She wasn't just playing Cleopatra, they said. She was Cleopatra herself reincarnated, chosen by the gods to play this role. Cleopatra was a massive commercial success and the film event of the year. One reviewer wrote, "The picture is so big that one is completely overwhelmed. It seemed as if a fortune must have been expended in each scene which appears on the screen, and the spectacle simply beggars description." Theda's performance received mixed reviews. Some praised her for capturing the very essence of the Egyptian queen, while others rolled their eyes at her exaggerated facial expressions. There was also a lot of unkind discussion about her body. Theda had a very healthy figure throughout her life, but as the 1910s progressed, the ideal of female beauty started moving away from the curvy hourglass figure that she had to a more flat, streamlined silhouette that would later become the flapper look. So lots of reviewers body-shamed her, calling her, quote, well-fed and dowdy, more of a matron than a vamp queen. Censorship boards around the country were also displeased by the amount of skin she had on display. They called for scenes in which Theda is shown with her legs, breasts and navel exposed, as well as scenes where she's embracing Caesar and Antony to be cut out of the film. The success of Cleopatra motivated Fox to put Theda in a new genre of films, historical epics, or superproductions, as they were called back then. She was decked out in wigs and costumes and made to play vamps from the past. In 1917, she played Madame du Barry, the tragic and notorious mistress of French King Louis XV, who was executed for treason during the French Revolution. In 1918, she played Salome, a biblical princess who is remembered in infamy for ordering the execution of John the Baptist. But these lavish, epic films were basically Theda's last big hits. The films Fox was assigning her were becoming worse and less commercially successful. For example, take Theda's 1918 film, The Soul of the Buddha. Theda was cast as Bhavahari, a Buddhist priestess from Japan who flees to Europe and becomes a celebrated dancer there. However, Bhavahari is pursued by a vengeful monk who wishes to punish her for leaving her, and I wish I was kidding about this, sacred duties as a dancing girl for the god Buddha, and murders her while she's on stage. As you can imagine, it is an incredibly racist film that relies heavily on yellowface and stereotypes about dangerous foreigners from the East. Fox's PR team eagerly exploited this aspect of the film, asking theaters to scatter Hindu death signs around their premises when showing the film, and organizing this photo shoot where Theda poses sexily with a Buddha statue. Unsurprisingly, the film bombed. And The Soul of the Buddha is just one example. Theda played many such exotic foreign vamp roles in the late 1910s. Before long, the public grew tired of these cheap, silly projects. Critics tore them to shreds in newspapers, and for the first time since she dramatically broke onto the silent screen, Theda's films began losing money. She was listless and unenthusiastic at work. She was vamping, but her heart was not in it anymore. Theda knew that she was on shaky ground. Her films were not doing well, and her 5-year contract with Fox was almost up. She needed to reinvent herself. So she went in search of a non-vamp role and found one in Kathleen Mavourneen. Based on an old Irish song, the film tells the tale of a poor Irish girl who is kidnapped and forcibly married to a wealthy neighbor. The story ends with the biggest cliché of all time. Kathleen wakes up, realizes it was all a dream, and rides away into the sunset with her true lover. Fox chose Charles Brabin, a tall Englishman with a beaky nose and a hawk-like face, to direct the movie, and Theda was immediately struck by him. Sparks began to fly on set between director and actress. Before the film's release, Theda gave a long, explosive interview to Vanity Fair where she spoke, pulling no punches, about how tired she was of being a vamp. "I have learned," she said, "from bitter experience, the dreary monotony of a one-role career. I am striving to broaden out, to create all types of heroines, to keep from identifying myself with any definite character. I am going to try to play all sorts of roles in all sorts of pictures, although for years to come anyway, I absolutely refuse to admit any vampire parts into my repertory." This was a bold move. By so openly criticizing the role that had made her famous, Theda was burning bridges with Fox. However, Theda's high hopes for Kathleen Mavourneen would soon be dashed. Ironically, her sweet, non-vamp film about an innocent young girl would end up being her most controversial movie yet. The film sparked protests and riots. Groups of young Irishmen, angered by the film's depiction of poverty in Ireland and concerned that their homeland was being depicted in an inaccurate, overly negative light, attacked theatres and demanded that the film be pulled from screens. There was also anger about Theda, a Jewish actress, being cast as an Irish woman. She even received death threats, and eager to stop the unrest, Fox quickly pulled the film. This incident left Theda utterly discouraged. She returned to Fox to do a few more contractually obliged vamp films, but she was done. With her film career in shambles, Theda roused herself for one last performance, this time on the stage. She signed on for an incredibly melodramatic, incredibly terrible play called The Blue Flame. Why she chose this particular play is a mystery. It is truly awful and not at all a worthy script for such a talented performer. Theda played a woman who dies when struck by lightning, but is brought back to life, Frankenstein style, by her scientist husband. But she comes back as, surprise surprise, a ruthless vampire. The play's opening night in Boston was literally a riot. Thousands of people turned up to see the vamp of the silent screen in the flesh. The police had to even be called to control the crowds outside the theater. When the play hit Broadway, Theda played sold-out shows every night for 2 months and then went on tour around the country. She made an absolute pile of money, nearly $15,000 a week in New York, which converts to around $250,000 today. The Blue Flame made Theda a wealthy woman, but she also became a laughingstock in the papers. Reviewers were vicious about the play and about Theda's performance. To see a crude actress, no matter how famous she is in the film, unfamiliar with the rudiments of the dramatic art, strutting about extravagantly in a series of maudlin episodes, is really not worth 15 minutes' time. So, ouch. After she returned to New York, Theda took a step back from acting. She and Charles Brabin had been having a quiet romance for years, and in 1921 she married him. Brabin proved to be a conservative, old-fashioned kind of husband and discouraged Theda from pursuing her screen career. But, ever ambitious, she continued to try. She spent the next 4 years mostly out of the public eye, looking for a comeback role, and found one in 1925 with The Unchastened Woman. The Unchastened Woman is kind of a tongue-in-cheek comedy version of her former vamp roles, a light-hearted, campy movie about a woman who, after finding out that her husband is cheating on her, goes to Europe and starts living a scandalous, notorious life there. The movie ends with Theda's character taking back her groveling, apologetic husband and returning to her family. It wasn't a bad movie, but the industry had moved on since Theda's heyday. Theda was almost 40 and couldn't compete with the modern flappers who dominated the screen in the mid-20s. These girls were cool, jazzy young things, and compared to them, Theda and her movies seemed impossibly old-fashioned. the film got mixed reviews upon release and wasn't a huge hit. So even though Theda did appear on screen one more time, this time in a comedy short called Madame Mystery, it seemed as though she had begun to accept that her career, like all good things, was coming to an end. The rest of Theda's life was quiet and content. Unlike a lot of Hollywood sex symbols who crumbled under the constant objectification, criticism, and invasion of their personal life and met tragic premature ends, Theda managed to leave her career behind relatively unscathed. A lot of it had to do with her age. She was older than most traditional sex symbols, and a lot of it had to do with her personality. She seemed to have been a rather calm, sensible woman with a good head on her shoulders who could separate her public persona from her private life. She and her husband moved back home to Cincinnati, where Theda transitioned from vamp to elegant society woman. She was often seen at balls and parties with her husband, and one of her neighbors remembered her as an elegant gray-haired lady who spent hours in her garden every day and baked cookies for the neighborhood children. One reporter, who interviewed her years into her retirement, was shocked to find her as happy and youthful as ever, content with her life and with no real desire to get back on screen. She talked quite happily about the movie stars of today, Jean Harlow and Mae West, the new vamps, and commented that the wickedest thing she had done on screen 15 years ago would seem tame in comparison to their antics. Theda lived till the 1950s. She lived to see Hollywood's most famous sex symbol, Marilyn Monroe, hit the screens and offered a creepily prophetic analysis of Marilyn's situation. "I think, like everyone else, that she's sexy," Theda said, "but I don't believe she likes it much, does she? She probably will have the same trouble I have had. She will never be able to live down her reputation." In 1954, after several months of weight loss and stomach upsets, Theda was diagnosed with colon cancer. She underwent a series of surgeries, but by then the cancer had spread to her liver and become inoperable. In February 1955, she fell into a coma. She awoke from this coma once, on the 5th of April, but soon lost consciousness and died a few days later. She was 69. People still remembered her. There were obituaries, but they did not exactly know what to make of her. Theda was not a respected actress, you see. Silent films had by then firmly become a thing of the past, an object of ridicule, a remnant of cinema's crude past. And Theda herself was a relic. Her exaggerated acting and cardboard cutout characters were considered worthy of mockery, not admiration. And what are we to make of Theda now, over a century later? Well, it's complicated. Theda had an unusually short career. She was only making popular films for 5 to 7 years of her life. But during that short period, she attained enormous fame and left behind a legacy that remains to this day. Theda's characters might not have been feminist in the modern sense of the word, but her subversive aesthetic influenced generations of women, from goth girls to punk rockers and emo chicks. And given the loss of her films, that's what we have to remember Theda by today. Strange, beautiful, eerie images of a handsome woman with striking eyes, dressed in black, an image of femininity that exuded both power and danger. A woman who was a product of her time, certainly, and whose characters reflected the conservative ideals of her day, but also managed to transcend them.